Our final presentation here before we move into the forum section will be delivered by Chris Manganello. Manganello, excuse me, I apologize. I've been working on that all break and I just blew it. Fortunately, this is my last introduction because I think Paul just fired me anyway. So, Chris is the policy director at the Georgia River Network in Athens. He has spent his lifetime researching questions about water, particularly in coastal Georgia and the South. He received a PhD from the University at Georgia under the direction of Dr. Paul Sutter, where his dissertation was awarded the Rachel Carson Prize by the American Society for Environmental History. His new book, Southern Water, Southern Power, has received much acclaim and continues to explore the questions of water in the South, of which we're going to hear so much about today. He has taught at Georgia Perimeter College and the University of Georgia, but he blends as a public history persona and working more on the immediate questions of policy today. He balances the Academy, though, continues to publish, has published an article in the Environmental History of the American South that has been frequently cited here, and has also published in the Journal of Southern History, the Journal of the History of Biology and Southern Cultures. And he also reaches a wide audience, and one of the younger, new generation, I won't say younger, but what we see increasingly a new generation of academics who is engaging the public seriously and thoughtfully through online blogs. And he edits the blog Georgia Water Wire. Today he's going to talk to us about the people who came together to produce the Coastal Marshlands Act of 1970. So please join me in welcoming Chris Manganello.
Thanks for everybody, for folks who've been here since Thursday. I appreciate you still being here and coming back. And certainly also want to thank the organizers, thank Paul and Chris and the staff at the Osball Foundation. You know, when Paul approached me for this project a couple years ago, I would be actually have presented something very differently if he had contacted me a month earlier. That the Southern Cultures piece wrote about kind of the fisheries in the Savannah River. I kind of was in process to get published with Southern Cultures. So I kind of had to come up with another project, and I had known that I wanted to write about the kind of the politics of the environment and the coastal plain. And I kind of cast about, I don't know if folks here are familiar with the name Ogden Doremus. He was a lawyer from Metter and Savannah, and was very involved in kind of environmental politics in the 70s, 80s, and onward, and I couldn't kind of break the resources and get into any kind of material there. So I kind of had to cast about for something else to write about. But the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act, which I'm going to talk about today, was kind of what was also on my mind, and at the time I also was aware that Mark Finley, who had helped kind of be the brainchild behind this. He had been working on a long project. He kind of called it the Osball manuscript, and through Paul and Chris and Mark Finley, they graciously allowed me to take a look at this manuscript because of my interest in writing about the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act, and so of this kind of longer manuscript that Mark had produced, there was a pretty sizable chunk about the Act and the Marshlands Bill. And I read the manuscript, and I had kind of already started to look at some of the resources that were out there, and kind of realized that Mark had written a pretty good chunk of this. So a lot of the, I would say, you know, a pretty big chunk of what's going to be published in this the proceedings of this conference, a good chunk of that is from Mark. I did a lot of my own research, looked at a lot of the same kind of primary sources that Mark looked at, you know, the kind of the introduction and conclusion are really all my own, but what I am thankful that I can be a part of helping bring some of Mark's work into daylight. And I will say that kind of every time I ran into Mark, which would usually be at a conference or some sort of workshop like this, I was usually only kind of half of his purpose for being there. He always seemed to have like an alternative purpose to go sit in the archive and do research for the other half of wherever we were. And so he has made a lot of great contributions to agricultural and environmental history. And so again, I'm just thankful to be able to help bring those contributions to Georgia's environmental history that, again, advance his labor. As Chris said, I work for Georgia River Network. We're based in Athens. We're a nonprofit. We work to engage and empower folks all over the state of Georgia to enjoy and protect their rivers. And I'm the policy director and work primarily on the advocacy piece. So if folks want any more information about that, I've got some up here about Georgia River Network. I'm happy to talk with you about that. But let me go ahead and get started here. On a sunny winter morning in Atlanta, Senator Ronald Adams rose from his seat on the chamber floor beneath the Gold Dome. From the well, he voiced his support for the Marshlands Bill, also known by its bill number, House Bill 212. Representative Reed Harris, a lawyer from Brunswick, just south of here, had introduced the bill a year earlier on the other side of the state capitol in the House of Representatives. Harris's bill to protect Georgia's coastal marshlands from development had narrowly cleared that state House of Representatives in 1969 by a single vote that was cast by the Speaker. For the next year, the bill languished in the Senate chamber until it passed unanimously amid poetry and applause during the General Assembly's 1970 session. The Coastal Marshlands Protection Act was then on its way to the governor's desk, where a business-friendly Lester Maddox had already threatened to veto the bill. When Senator Adams when he rose to speak to the bill, he spoke to more than just the bill's merits. Adams was also from the coastal city of Brunswick, and he read from Sidney Lanier's well-known and famous poem, The Marshes of Glynn, as he spoke for the bill. Born in Macon, Lanier captured Georgia's landscape and culture and verse from the mountains to the sea. So when Adams read Lanier's words, he tapped into a culture he shared with his fellow legislators and Georgians who would all lobby for the bill. Quote, "These marshes were beautiful for Sidney Lanier 100 years ago," Adams explained. Quote, "They are beautiful for us now. Let us save them for our children and our children's children." Like Adams, thousands of Georgians understood what was at stake on the coast in 1970 and why House Bill 212 was necessary. So this is a story about Georgia's coast. It's also about the beginning of the Sun Belt's modern environmental movement. And more specifically, it's about the origins of the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act of 1970. Like most environmental policy success stories, the effort to save the marsh was a reaction to a substantial and a real threat. Oklahoma-based phosphate miners were eyeing more than 70,000 acres of Georgia's salt marsh, barrier islands, and offshore seabed. They had a vision of converting thousands of acres of the marsh into dry land for homes and golf course communities. And in response, the campaign to protect Sidney Lanier's Marshes of Glynn involved respected scientists who authored an environmental impact statement before these things were even required. It involved state agency staff who took their charge to protect natural resources seriously. It involved a legislative champion who risked his career. And it involved a grassroots army of garden club ladies. In the end, the marsh escaped the phosphate miners' dredge and real estate developers' bulkheads. And instead, by protecting the marsh, the state of Georgia supported a vision of property rights that expected owners, including the state itself, to own nature and act responsibly. Aside from Sidney Lanier's influence, there was a small circle of civic-minded Georgians that built a large statewide coalition to protect this marsh. And I would argue one of the largest and kind of the first really statewide movements to this degree. And they were responsible for propelling Georgia into the age of environmentalism. Among the many public voices was a name we've also heard this morning and all through the week, or excuse me, the last couple of days, was Professor Eugene Odom, who emerged as the most respected professional scientist to speak for the coast. Odom is often referred to the father of modern ecology. He published the first ecology textbook in 1953. But more than anything else, in working with all of his colleagues, what he possessed was a keen ability to translate complex scientific information into a language for general audiences. Other figures that were involved in this kind of mobilization of a huge coalition across the state involved someone named Bob Haney, Jane Hurt Yarn, Rock Howard, who we heard mentioned earlier, and others. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about these folks. That there's just not enough time in terms of the paper, but there is more information on these folks that'll be forthcoming in the book. So why did the coast matter to these and other Georgians? Georgia's coastal landscape is tidally influenced. It's visually defined by the presence of marsh cordgrass and comprised of an arrangement of outer and inner barrier islands, much as Buddy yesterday kind of showed us all these different islands. Odom and his colleagues considered the marsh a nutrient trap that turned the space between those barrier islands and the mainland into one of the world's most productive nurseries for shrimp, crabs, oysters, finfish, migratory birds, and other aquatic and terrestrial creatures. In 1968, Odom argued, quote, "The potential yield of meat from the estuaries is greater on a per-acre basis than is possible by land animal husbandry. Accordingly, the Georgia tidelands must be considered as potentially among the most productive of the state's agricultural landscapes." The estuaries at the time were estimated to support a $30 million commercial and sport fishery and industry, and those are in 1970s dollars, 30 million. In roughly 100 in the roughly 100 miles between the Savannah River and the St. Mary's River, these 13 barrier islands lined the Georgia coast. And between the islands and the mainland lies an estimated 378,000 acres of tidal salt marsh and 12% of the East Coast's freshwater tidal marsh. These facts and arguments would infuse the public campaign to save the marsh. So most of the Georgians who lobbied Senator Adams and his colleagues, they weren't commercial fishermen, and they weren't steeped necessarily in the science of the marsh. They would, of course, learn that. But the voters did know something special about the coast's 8 major islands: Cumberland, Sapelo, St. Catharines, Ossabaw, Wausau, Jekyll, St. Simons, and Tybee. Most of the islands were owned by a handful of America's wealthiest families over time, including the Reynolds, Carnegies, Fords, Nobles, Candlers. And regardless of science and avocation, hobby, or socioeconomic status, the visitors and residents to Georgia and from Georgia knew what was special and important about the Empire State of the South's coastline. By the mid-1960s, there were threats to the Georgia coast, and they were coming from multiple directions. There was untreated industrial pollution that was threatening a way of life, and that had threatening a way of life that had sustained coastal people for generations. The oyster and the crab catch, these things were all in decline. By the mid-1960s, the craft and paper mills that William talked about, like Union Camp and Continental Can in Savannah, and chemical operations like American Cyanamid, these were dumping millions of gallons of waste into the Savannah River each day. This, of course, was joining the untreated sewage of over 100,000 residents of the city of Savannah. And this is all before 1972, when the Clean Water Act, that as we understand it today, came into being and is eventually cleaned up and helped clean up a lot of this pollution. Not necessarily all of it, but most of it. But perhaps the greatest threat came from developers. Tax policy became a continual threat. Local county tax assessors were essentially becoming land use planners for entire ecosystems. Their notion of what defined the, quote, highest and best use of any land, it all had drastic ecological implications, not to mention the social implications of, for poor, minority, and elderly property owners that we've touched on in some of the more recent situation, but there also were issues of folks losing land to condemnation. Other developers envisioned roads. In 1965, planners with the State Highway Department submitted a proposal for an island-hopping scenic highway that would connect Tybee, Wausau, Ossabaw, St. Catharines, and Jekyll, right? Imagine a causeway down the coast is what they were discussing, which would, of course, kind of provided this kind of potential loop with the I-95 that they were building for folks to get on. And real estate developers were, of course, very eager to develop the coastal region, and they wanted to replicate successes in places like success in their minds, at places like Hilton Head in South Carolina and Marco Island, which seemed to instantly attract tourists and increase the tax base. Altogether, for many Georgians, the coast faced a wide range of predators, as one writer summed it up. Quote, foreign chemical manufacturers, heavy industry, developers who now have whole recreation cities on the drawing board. These were the threats that were clearly being articulated. And Eugene Odom agreed to a particular point. Quote, we're being invaded, he said. The carpetbaggers are coming back, and we're not prepared to manage the associated development and all the environmental impacts. And he said this at kind of one of his early famous kind of teach-ins on the environment and ecology. So while hunting and fishing and conservation organizations had existed in Georgia before 1965, there were no organizations advocating for Georgia's land, air, and water in kind of a cohesive or statewide process. This would change in 1966 when the environmental movement in Georgia would reach a new level of organization. A high school teacher named Bob Haney and a congressman named James McKay both connected in Atlanta in the mid-60s. And they both became convinced that it was time to form a new organization to, quote, understand and guard the total environment. McKay would obtain a grant from the National Office of the Nature Conservancy to fund Bob Haney's initial 6-month contract to get a new statewide nonprofit organization up and running. That organization exists today and is known as the Georgia Conservancy. The early work of the Georgia Conservancy coincided with the formative months of another new state agency called the Georgia Natural Areas Council. Beginning in 1961, another prominent kind of person in these early stages of environmentalism in Georgia was a professor from Georgia State College named Charles Wharton. Charlie urged the state government to more actively protect valuable areas, and he provided evidence that other states had taken such steps to avoid these problems. There were a few state legislators, including 2 future governors, Jimmy Carter and Zell Miller, who embraced this idea, and Miller would actually go on to introduce in 1966 a law to establish the Georgia Natural Areas Council. They cast about for a new director of this thing, this new state agency, and so Bob Haney was recommended. Haney at the time was a 29-year-old with a master's degree in history, and he was already working for the Conservancy, and he's the one that got the job. He apparently beat out at least one other candidate. And while several of the council's early projects were in the Atlanta area, Haney would soon expand its mission to include engagement with Georgia's coast. And so he started traveling the state, both as he was working for the Conservancy and also for the Natural Areas Council, and he would begin building relationships with folks of like mind. And perhaps the most influential and powerful person that he met was Jane Hurt Yarn. Jane Hurt Yarn emerged from Atlanta's Garden Club culture to become one of the state's leading environmental activists. Later, she would serve as President Jimmy Carter's, or one of Jimmy Carter's environmental policy advisors in Washington. If Haney was a bit of a kind of a countercultural, I mean, you kind of read about what Haney did and the things he said, and he's just like, he is full-on counterculture. If he was this kind of countercultural visionary, then Jane Hurt Yarn was really kind of the higher society person with the network and the thick contact book. And like many women of her era, her social network would revolve around these garden clubs. And atypically, however, she thought these organizations abounded with women whose talents were being wasted. So there were many issues that were affecting Georgia's air, land, and water and the people who cared. But one issue would emerge and mobilize a great number of Georgia citizens, including Haney, Yarn, the garden clubs, folks that were members of the Georgia Conservancy. And this one kind of single event were plans to dredge large sections of Georgia's coast and the marshes of Glynn in order to mine for phosphate. So the search for phosphate along the Atlantic coastal plain has a long history. It dates to mines, in South Carolina and Florida. This is in Florida. It's an open strip mine. And in Georgia, in 1966, a subsidiary of the Oklahoma-based Kerr-McGee Corporation announced the discovery of what they were claiming was one of the biggest phosphate deposits ever found. So you have to bear with me here. It's a little convoluted, but the deposit was located under 40 feet of water off Wausau Island and other areas of the coast. So the company began discussing extraction plans, and they assured local residents that they would, quote, preserve and beautify the area, and that the mining should raise no concern among the, quote, fish, game, and anti-pollution supporters. So a year and a half later, Kerr-McGee submitted an application to the Georgia Mineral Leasing Commission, signaling the company's interest in submitting a bid for the mineral leases that were covering a portion of over 72,000 acres of what was considered state-owned underwater land. The red arrow is Savannah, where we actually are, I think, today. And then the top of the map there is the Savannah River, and those are, Tybee Island is up there on the upper right. But this was kind of a part of the proposal to mine. These are the different tracts that the company Kerr-McGee was considering. These tracts here were among the tracts, and then of course in the actual marsh itself is where the company was also proposing to dredge. So the company planned to mine the minerals from the coastal seafloor, as deep as perhaps 100 feet below the ocean's surface. They proposed to then, after they kind of pulled this dredged material up, they proposed dumping the millions of tons of exhumed sea bottom onto Georgia's marshes and barrier islands. The company boldly suggested that this overburden, as it's called, which is this dredged material, once you remove the phosphate minerals from it, that this kind of dredged material could be used to expand the landmass of the Georgia coast, beginning with the expansion of Little Tybee Island. The master plan called for new beaches, golf courses, canals, marinas, homes, condominiums, and tourist amenities. These plans would have turned the region into a series of bulkhead communities, not unlike those found in Florida. And this is Marco Island, I think in 72, 73. So the mining proposal immediately mobilized, as you can imagine, mobilized activists and the politicians and folks throughout the state. This mining proposal was a transformative episode for the protection of Georgia's islands and the hundreds of thousands of acres of marshlands. And of course, it really is central in galvanizing Georgia's emerging environmentalism and environmentalists. And there were kind of a handful of other big issues that were circulating in the state. There was Soil Conservation Service was doing dredging all over and doing stream channelization projects. There were discussions about the Chattooga Wild and Scenic River that emerged in the late 60s. Issues like damming the Flint River. The Army Corps of Engineers had plans to dam Sparrow Bluff in the Flint River. And so these things were all kind of coming together at the same time, but it really, in my sense, is that it was really the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act that really pulled everybody in the state together. And among the reasons why everybody was coming together was that a previously reticent Eugene Odom would take on a much more public role, and he soon became a household name in Georgia. People around the state learned about the notion of ecology for the first time, especially as it applied to coastal, barrier island, and estuarine environments. And virtually every activist and journalist, an editorial board who would begin to speak out on the issue, directly and indirectly, they spoke about Odom's lessons on the importance of the marshlands in supporting both economic and ecological systems. Meanwhile, Georgia's regulatory institutions did not sit idly by. Rock Howard, who was the head of the Water Quality Control Board, which is, for folks who in Georgia, the Environmental Protection Division today was preceded by the Water Quality Control Board. Rock Howard stressed the risks that the dredging in the marsh would pose to groundwater supplies. Howard was not opposed to mining per se, but he was adamantly opposed to mining in the marsh, without a doubt. He said, quote, "We have to be very selective as to what industries we introduced into Georgia's waters. God gave us this great perpetual resource, and we ought to take care of it." The state would go on to hold a series of public hearings in Atlanta and on the coast, and there was clear opposition among members of the public, General Assembly, and agency staff to Kerr-McGee's proposal for dredging in the marsh. In the wake of all of this public and professional blowback, the state's Mineral Leasing Commission ultimately denied Kerr-McGee's bid to mine 25,000 acres and return a deposit check in December of 1968. So effectively, the dredging proposal that brought everybody really to the table was dead, but killing the proposal was not the same as winning the war. So along with these other advocates, the issue caught the attention of Reed Harris, who was a young state representative and attorney from Brunswick. Harris had already been interested in the damages caused by surface mining in Georgia, and in 1969, he had helped co-sponsor and pass the Surface Mining Land Use Act, which brought some modest regulation of Georgia's kaolin and other mining industries in the state. By all indication, the marsh's future lay in the hands of legislators like Harris, who would ultimately present his marshlands bill to the Georgia House of Representatives in January of 1969. And this would be the beginning of a 14-month legislative project. And passage of Harris's Marshlands Bill was certainly something that would affect many and potential plans for economic development on Georgia's coast, and it would prove much more difficult to achieve than the defeat of a specific proposal like Kerr-McGee's request. Nearly all of the political, economic, and industrial leaders in his own district opposed the bill. But Harris worked hard to get the bill through the House with a slim majority. The bill to protect Georgia's 378,000 acres of coastal marshlands would ultimately pass the Senate amid poetry and applause without a dissenting vote. In the final form, the bill created the Coastal Marshlands Protection Agency with the power to implement the Marshlands Act. The new agency was empowered to vet proposals to alter state-owned marsh and brackish marsh. They were empowered to issue permits for these activities as well as enforce any compliance with the act. Additionally, the bill required applications for proposed work, it required public notice, public hearings, and that any construction had to be completed within a 2-year period of time. So after this kind of long, complex battle over a specific issue and then the legislative struggle, the bill to protect the marshlands would ultimately lay on Governor Lester Maddox's desk in 1970. And despite passage through both chambers, many observers remained unsure if the business-friendly governor would actually veto the bill as he had threatened to do on more than one occasion. Opponents to Harris's bill, the Marshlands Bill, argued that it would control development on private property and usurp local control. As many in Georgia know, the home rule is often a part of these legislative battles as far as what local governments can do and if the legislature can handcuff them. Local governments, like the city of Brunswick, wanted to retain responsibility for evaluating proposals for the development in the marsh in Brunswick and Glynn County. But Harris, as well as the state's attorney general and others, would all push back against these interests. And they, quote, expressed strong doubts about any claims to ownership of the tidal marsh because those titles were so unclear. The Attorney General's office, the Georgia Attorney General, would ultimately, they wouldn't necessarily issue an opinion, but they issued, I think, what was kind of effectively called a position paper. And they stated that the marshlands of Georgia are not susceptible to private exploitation or conservation without regard to the common law trust purposes to which these lands have long been dedicated. In other words, the marsh really effectively was the responsibility of the state, and the state had the responsibility to manage that resource in the public trust. 10 days after the Attorney General's position paper was published, Reed Harris's bill remained on the governor's desk unsigned. And on March 27th of 1970, which was really the last day for the governor to sign the bill, he either had to sign the bill, he had to veto the bill, or it would automatically become law. And as you can probably guess, most governors like to take a position on something as significant as this, so just letting it pass wasn't going to happen. On March 27th, all of the bill's supporters were summoned to the governor's office by Maddox's executive secretary, Zell Miller. They did not know, they hadn't really been communicated to them whether or not the governor was actually going to sign the bill. But with everybody in the room, Maddox explained that he understood it was a controversial bill, that he had had a lot of conversations about the bill with people, and in Reed Harris's memoir, Harris says that, Maddox said something to the effect, Eugene Odom is kind of this kind of global force, and so if I kind of have to listen to him. And also, I mean, again, like Jane Hurt Yarn had kind of turned up the political screws and had also had this massive letter campaign that Maddox claimed had produced enough letters to fill 3 barrels. And so he just really had this kind of tremendous public pressure, and in the end would ultimately concede, and he signed the bill. Some say he kind of graciously passed the pens around after the signing. Others say he threw the pens over his shoulder. So, but there are really 4 important lessons, I think, to this story. The first is really about property rights, or more specifically, really owning nature responsibly. The marsh is technically owned by the state and is protected in the public trust. So this was really a fight to save the marsh. This was not really about the uplands. It was not about the rivers. It was really ultimately, would the marsh's fate be determined by a few property owners, namely industrial interests in Brunswick and Savannah, and their claims to the marsh? Or would the marsh live on as property protected by the state for the people of Georgia, including many who were still dependent upon the marsh for their own economic betterment. In the end, the state did not support a vision of property rights that accepted an anything-goes future. Instead, the state accepted a role to protect the public trust and a vision that expected property owners, including the state itself, to act and own nature responsibly. Even Eugene Odom understood this to a particular degree when he said, "The question is not who owns the coastal area, but who's responsible for it." A second lesson is that this campaign to protect the marsh was George's role, as I've said before, was really this first kind of moment of modern environmentalism, and it was really the major environmental campaign in the Sun Belt South. Campaigns to save the Flint River from dams and the Chattahoochee River from sewer lines would follow. And as I mentioned, of course, when we ended up, there's the Chattooga National Wild and Scenic River, and there were other issues as well in the 70s. And in each case, Georgians would rally to protect beautiful landscapes forever while promoting healthy communities. A third lesson is that the Marshes Act was really a critical piece of reactionary legislation, and it protected the marsh. I often find myself kind of in conversation with folks. It's like, well, you know, environmentalists, it'd be great if you all did some proactive legislation or something like that. And I've thought about that long and hard now for the last couple of years, and I'm actually not convinced that really any legislation is proactive. I think legislation by nature is a response to a problem. And certainly this is a situation where you can argue it was proactive in the sense that this Coastal Marshes Protection Act, you know, prohibited marsh development, but again, it was in response to a problem. But my assessment of the Coastal Marshes Protection Act as far as, you know, passing and what it was intended to do, it should also not necessarily be construed to mean that the Marshes Act was or remains perfect. No legislation, its implementation, or on-the-ground enforcement will be perfect. But I do think that the Marshes Act also asks Georgians to stand at the edge of the marsh like Sidney Lanier had stood at the end of the marsh. But I would argue perhaps to stand with their backs to the marsh and to look landward, because that is where the fate of the marsh can be found. Odom and others essentially thought like a watershed. What happens on the land, in the forests, in agricultural operations, and at the mega industrial sites, many of which are still not developed, along the state's 70,000 miles of rivers, creeks, and streams matter for the coast. History tells us that the Marshes Protection Act protected one part of the whole. It protected the marsh. But it also, I think, tells us to look upstream to the other part to ensure that the marsh and the whole system survives. And I think it's important to remember that, you know, Odom thought in systems, but he also was very direct in thinking like a watershed. You know, if Aldo Leopold thought like a mountain, I think we can make the argument that Odom thought like a watershed. So the final lesson, aside from this kind of owning nature responsibly, to other than a lesson of the emergence of Georgia's environmental movement, other lesson of kind of where we're supposed to kind of go from the Coastal Marshes Protection Act, I think that the final lesson is that science alone did not influence the politics. The arts influenced the legislators. When Senator Ronald Adams referred to Sidney Lanier's Marshes of Glen during the floor debate for Harris's Marshlands bill, he illustrated one reason why saving the marsh was actually really an easy lift. In 1970, nearly every grown adult who had attended primary school in Georgia had probably memorized Lanier's lyrical homage to the coast. When Rock Howard, for example, was asked to review an early version of Harris's proposed bill, he recommended, quote, "The term wetlands be dropped in the favor of the designation marshes, a term we use commonly and about which poetry is written." And again, this is a state regulator, giving the thumbs up on how to get this legislation through. Because many Georgians, like Rock Howard and of the Water Quality Control Board, knew the poem, they identified with the coast and the Golden Isles, even if they had never visited the place. And because they identified with the coast, they knew they had to speak for the marsh that had so clearly spoken to Sidney Lanier. So in closing, I find it appropriate that the kind of one of the largest artificial lakes in the state of Georgia that supplies more than a third of Georgia's population in metro Atlanta with drinking water was also named to honor Sidney Lanier. Naming the Lake Lanier after Lanier was easy given references to another one of his poems, right? The Song of the Chattahoochee, which talks about the hills of Habersham, which is where Lake Lanier is today. But at Lake Lanier, I also see a direct link between the mountains and the sea. And a reminder to think about Eugene Odom and Georgia's first environmentalists who wanted to protect the marsh and everything that feeds that system. Thank you.
Given the dynamic nature of salt marsh and the tendency for it to move in and out as things change, and the likelihood with ocean rising that it's going to move into highland, does the Protection Act anticipate this, or does it define relatively static limits to the marsh?
So, kind of a multiple-fold answer. I think that the marsh is defined in terms of the vegetation, right? So the kind of what constitutes the regulatory purview of the coastal marshlands or the Coastal Protection Division that enforces the Coastal Marshlands Act today. It's defined, the marsh and their kind of realm of responsibility is defined in part by the presence of certain types of vegetation, as well as some tide line. So in a sense, arguably, with sea level rise, in theory, it could work along, I mean, it could work in the event of, or when we see sea level rise, but I think that, I think probably the larger thing to deal with is actually getting folks to understand that the sea level rise is going to happen, and making that a part of the kind of larger political conversation that I think that William was alluding to, that you know, we can talk about all the regulation in the world that we think is going to work, but until the politicians help us have that legitimate conversation, it's really hard. Oh, and I will say that I do think, to kind of just to follow on that, I think that as far as how to address climate change in Georgia, because I think you bring up a point I've been thinking about, and again, based on the work that I've done all over the state, that conversation is going to have to come from the coast. I mean, you know, it's not going to come from somebody in Atlanta. It's not going to come from me living in Athens. I can certainly talk about it and I can articulate what I think is important, but because I don't live here and because I don't influence those politicians who live here, my level of influence is limited. So I think that in Georgia, the dealing with climate change is going to have to come from the coast, and it shouldn't be that hard given what we've seen happen on Tybee Island recently and the quote-unquote nuisance flooding that's happening all over the southeast as well in Georgia. In some ways, it shouldn't be hard for us to start convincing our politicians.
Could you comment on what you perceive to be the threat of invasives changing the marshland, and if there is a degree there of concern that they may actually succumb to invasives taking over and changing their ecology, and the degree to which then we might need regulation? That seems to be not happening in the state government.
Yeah, this is probably a little bit in the realm outside of my capacity to really refer to or respond to in terms of specific species. That's this is where I say I was trained as a historian and not even in public in government and whatnot, but certainly not in science. I'm not sure how it's difficult to, in the big scheme of things, it's difficult, I think, to regulate for invasive species, particularly on a large scale. And so I'm not really sure what the best mechanism is going to be for that.
Chris, I was wondering if, you said that you thought it was difficult to be proactive on legislation. I was wondering how you might frame that with the subsequent Shore Protection Act, whether it was proactive or really in response to development, and also, but also the thing that ties the two together is the influence. Even if scientists couldn't drive it, but the ecologists had a lot to do with the way in which the regulations were set up.
Right, and the Shore Protection Act, which came a few years later after the Coastal Marshes Protection Act, that's also something I'm not really capable of speaking to that particular act. I will say that folks should understand that act will, I do know this, that act will be opened up for revision probably in the next year or two. So just be paying attention to that in terms of how to anticipate maybe some of these questions about climate change and how those sorts of issues can be adapted to statute that was created 30, 40 years ago when we weren't kind of worried about some of these particular issues and that the issues have changed. I mean, we're certainly never going to see mining and dredging in the marsh. That doesn't mean that. I think the threats to the marsh now are in some ways much more smaller and kind of point specific. You're dealing with non-point source pollution, and that those are issues that are kind of these kind of 1,000 little cuts are kind of, I think, the things to be thinking about into the future.
I just wanted to put in a plug. I think Rock Howard was wise to say if you were trying to get something through the legislature, they used the word marsh versus wetland. And I'm afraid I want to just put in plug for using the old names. We use wetland now, and it's, in a way, if you're a developer of land, it's sort of a negative thing. But the old names like Procosin and River Swamp and Gum Slough, Cypress Pond, Shrub Bog, that's what we ought to be using when we're asking to protect land and, and get away from using just plain wetlands. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the Coastal Marshes Protection Act went through a revision last year, and we were very conscious about what we're talking about, and it makes sense. Again, it's something that people are familiar with, much so, and wetlands is much more of a pejorative, as we can see if anybody's paying attention to the Environmental Protection Division, or I'm sorry, US EPA's revision of the Clean Water Act and the waters of the United States right now. Wetlands is a demon.
Yeah, just quickly, I don't have a question, but I did want to let the lady know in the back that there is a coastal invasive species management area that is being headed up by a partnership. So there is a specific focus. The SISMA is the acronym, and you can get information through Georgia DNR. But there's a partnership, private and public folks working specifically on coastal invasive species.
Thanks, Randy.
Partly a comment, but also a question. I actually had a conversation with, talking about something else, but a conversation with Gene Odom about state. And he was talking about internalizing environmental costs. I think that was the general.
Mike's not on.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I had conversation with Gene Odom about internalizing environmental costs, and actually him talking to me, a lot of conversations with Gene, that's the way it went. In fact, it almost always went that way. But he talked about this, and he talked about how convincing it was to those old crocs in the state legislature that marshlands had economic value, and how convincing it was that he could put a dollar value on that. I mean, this is really striking because we now talk a lot about ecological services, and we use computations of ecological services to make arguments about environmental protection. But to my knowledge, this is a kind of 1980s movement. So if there's another history here, and not only the specific one that you're talking about in the history of conservation in the Sun Belt, but also a larger history of the use of ecological services as part of a larger environmental argument or environmental movement argument, as well as a history of science thing. I mean, is there anything in the research that you've done that suggests that whether your words ecological services ever used, that suggests that Odom was thinking about that, or have you played it forward a little bit to see if this had any influence on this this kind of science as it developed in the 1980s?
I think the certainly the economic piece would, for example, that's what Jimmy Carter relied on when he, as governor, effectively shut down a proposal to build dams up and down the Flint River. That was like he used the economic argument, like we can't. There's the kind of the cost benefit doesn't work. As far as the ecological services in this example of the Coastal Marshes Protection Act, I mean, he didn't use that term, but he certainly was talking about, as I said, he was talking about the value of the marsh in terms of an agricultural landscape. And that, if I remember correctly, was in a document that he and a kind of a committee that the governor appointed. They put together a document that in a lot of ways looks like a proto environmental impact statement. This is again before NEPA, or would require an environmental impact statement. But what Odom and his colleagues did is they really they did a full assessment. They're like, what's the mining gonna look like? Physically, like what's it gonna look like? How are they gonna do this? Of which I should say the technology to mine the marsh did not exist. And so how they were actually going to dewater the marsh and the water off of Wausau and actually do the mining, the technology didn't exist. And so that was the other thing for a lot of people. They're like, well, how the heck are they going to do this? It would have been unprecedented. But anyways, that's one of the things that came out in this kind of proto-EIS. And that was where he made the comment about the specifics of the value of the fishery and the significance of what it provided in terms of energy flows and this kind of treating it like it was an agricultural field. To me, I was just like, wow, he's kind of thinking about this like it's a cornfield in terms of the what it provides from an economic standpoint, and that was an important service. I mean, I don't think he necessarily used that ecological service term, but I do think that, and this is a question I haven't done enough research into NEPA, which requires environmental impact statements today. That didn't come into being until 1970. And so I'm actually curious whether, like, how many other of these kind of proto-environmental impact statements were taking place in other parts of the country, or whether or not, like, how unique this even was, and that Odom was a part of it. I don't know if there's a piece there that also then kind of brings these environmental impact statements into kind of more vogue as being necessary to look at all these different aspects. And they would eventually, my sense too is that a couple years later, a similar thing would be done, obviously with the Cross Florida Barge Canal. I think that they did a kind of an equivalent of an environmental impact statement before those were technically required. So.
What's really interesting about this, though, is not just the, I hadn't thought about that, but the environmental impact statement, but the fixing of a dollar value on what he didn't call this an ecological service apparently, but on something that the marsh does for humans, and I don't know whether that was new or actually also the relationship of Odom with his brother Howard, who
right.
does, and what kind of role ecological economics
right.
played in this. But if one of the other histories, along with the one you're talking about, that we might want to out here is the history of that idea, ecological services, using ecological services to assess the value of a particular landscape.
Harley Wharton was actually a really important thing. Right. Take one more question. Ann?
Never said that to me. I think I heard you say when you were talking about the agency acronym or the agency name at the beginning of the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act. Was it at one time called the Coastal Protection Division? And if so, when did that linguistic shift change to Coastal Resources Division? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question.
I think that's
I mean, I don't know if there's anybody from CRD here today who could tell us when they became CRD.
That's an interesting shift.
Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate conversation today, and I also appreciate all the panelists. It's been nice to see how all of you have kind of touched on water in one way, shape, or form, directly and indirectly, just to demonstrate that obviously the coast is on the coast. But it's this, from Max's maps of like just this kind of all these rivers and creeks and streams, and all of like the way that people understood them and kind of projected them onto maps to talking about these living and working and leisure landscapes that all involved water, from oystering to recreation, to the kind of the spiritual nature of water as well. Water is an incredible resource, and as William was saying, it's not valued appropriately. Thank you.